Richard, Henry, William, and Adela. And so later on, I was fascinated that my grandmother's imagination was going to the story of British royalty. And of course, that's because of the colonial. But, so that in fact, even my critique of that is in a poem called The Lesson.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest, who will introduce herself. Merle, please go ahead.
My name is Merle Collins. I live in Maryland, USA. I was born in the Caribbean. In fact, I was born on the island of Aruba, a Dutch colony to Grenadian parents. I grew up in Grenada. And even with that simple statement of fact, we see that one can't escape the importance of history and politics to the stories of existence, like the working people have done for centuries from every country in the world. My parents migrated in search of opportunity in the 1940s, thinking that they could make a better life for themselves. Their being in Aruba meant that they responded to a need then for migrant labor, not by the Dutch colonial government, but by an American multinational corporation, the Lago Oil Refinery, because Aruba was a transshipment point. So this American multinational corporation, the Lago Oil and Transport Company, took crude oil from Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela to Aruba and thence to the US. So at my birth then, my parents were part of the service labor for this complex Spanish, Dutch, English-speaking organization of affairs in the continents of America. So that's how I was born in Aruba. Grenada was my childhood home because they returned, or, the word returned hides a multitude of things because they were actually laid off. And so they returned to Grenada soon after my birth. And perhaps that is partly why I'm interested in storytelling. Because, it says so much about how the individual life is not individual at all. It is inevitably connected to a whole network of social, economic, political relations. And so that's a little introductory part of my story. For the last 26 years, from 1995 to 2021, I've taught Caribbean literature at the University of Maryland in the US. At first at UMD, I also taught creative writing on the MFA program, but later I wanted to focus on Caribbean literature. For 2 years, from 2019 to 2021, I was director of the Latin American Studies Center, which is now the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center. I've studied and taught in the Caribbean. Caribbean was the 1970s, and that was high school, Grenada and St. Lucia. In the UK, in London, at the University of North London, and in the United States. So in a sense, although I didn't start off with that in mind, and generally I was following opportunities for education and helping to make it all possible with sometimes service type jobs were feasible. I think that the international travel has also been about a sense that connections among individuals and communities stretch far and wide. And I wanted to make those connections. I didn't always know what they would be, but I tried to hold on to them when they appeared. And the field has been education. Let me say a little bit more. I should say that for further education at any event, because mine was a smaller colonial Caribbean country, Grenada. At the time that I grew up, I had no choice but to leave the island if I wanted a university education. And so I still wanted to be in the Caribbean. Then I went to another part of the Caribbean, to the University of the West Indies, the Mona, Jamaica campus. And later on, when I returned, I was a secondary school teacher in Grenada, then in St. Lucia. And then, as I've said, still later, I taught at the university level in the UK and the USA. So that means I studied in Jamaica, here in Washington, DC, and also in London. And in an academic sense, literature, history, politics have been my interests. For a while during 1981 to 1983, after I returned from a Latin American studies degree in the US, I worked in Grenada with the Maurice Bishop government as a researcher on Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm very interested in issues of social justice, and the modalities, what I use, how I explore those interests. It's usually through teaching, writing, theater also, although I'm not an expert, but I'm always an interested participant in one way or the other in theater. And in fact, I started a community theater group here in Washington metropolitan area. I write and have published fiction, poetry, essays in the 90s in London. I was part of a Pan-Africanist poetry and music collective, the African Dawn, focusing a lot on socio-political protest and social justice issues. And Caravision Community Theater, which I mentioned, it hasn't been active during the last 3 or so years, but in the past we've performed in the Washington metropolitan area, often focusing on stories and experiences of Caribbean people, as told by Caribbean writers like Louise Bennett, Olive Senior, Leon Damas from French Guyana, Nancy Morejon from Cuba, Paloma Mohammed from Guyana, etc. So that gives some idea of my journey.
A very, very rich journey. If I may, I would like to ask you a couple of questions around, a lot that you covered. My first question is your remark around, your interest around storytelling. And I would like to take you back to your childhood. You grew up in Grenada. Do you still recall maybe, how your upbringing there then, made you the storyteller that you are today? Or contributed at least.
Yes. I like that question, but it takes me back to so many things. Because, again, I can't forget that Grenada, and this is in retrospect, because at the time I wasn't thinking that, was a small colonial, British colonial Caribbean country. So a lot that I was interested in was what was presented to me in the school system. And in my own imagination, I made a division between what was the proper language and the proper way to tell stories, which was what I was being introduced to at school, and what was the more exciting, but not necessarily, and I'm saying it, about what I thought then, not necessarily proper way to tell stories, that is using the Creole voice and, with the inflections, etc. That was less approved of, I guess, within the school system, which was very much focused on Romantics and the Victorians. So that was my educational thing. But at least my formal education, because, I have to be careful with use of the word education, because there's a lot of education that we get in the community that is excellent, but for one reason or the other may not be valued. At the time, my mother and my grandmother told lots of stories about their own lives, but I was clear in my head then. Later, I used those stories in my writing, and but at the time, I thought they were not as important as what I got in school. I was to discover, to think very differently later on. So in a real sense, I can say that the ways that my grandmother, for example, told stories, and the way that my mother told stories, those have had a tremendous impact on my life. Sometimes there were even things that I critiqued or thought about in different ways later. So that, for example, I remember my grandmother, when she became very old, at least I no longer think that was very old, but that's what I thought then. I remember my grandmother, and she may have had a bit of dementia at the time, although I didn't know it, but she would be walking and talking and just saying things that she remembered from her school days and her childhood. And she would say things like, and hear the colonial voice now, William the Conqueror. And even the way that I'm saying it is about her performance. William the Conqueror, the fourth son of the Duke of Normandy. He married Matilda. His children were Robert, Richard, Henry, William, and Adela. And so later on, I was fascinated that my grandmother's imagination was going to the story of British royalty. And of course, that's because of the colonial. But, so that in fact, even my critique of that is in a poem called The Lesson, which talks about the kind of colonial lesson and the way colonialism takes away, shapes the imagination. So, that gives you some sense of where the interest in the voice comes from, certainly from stories told by generally the women in my family. My father didn't tell as many stories unless he was pushed by my mother.
You have been a teacher in many different countries. So I have two questions around that. One is, what type of a teacher are you? And second question is, what are the differences if when you are teaching in the UK or teaching in the US or in the different settings, or are there no differences?
Right. There are differences, but that huge question, apparently you like to ask huge questions. But that huge question, what type of a teacher are you? I guess I'd have to let my students answer that. But I suspect that the answer would be different depending on where and at what time in my journey I was, encountered by by various people. I can think, for example, that I'm still very good friends with some of the people I taught in high school, for example. And I think at that time, because I was teaching in Grenada in particular. I remember the students in Grenada at a time when there was a lot of discussion. Here we're talking about the 1970s, a lot of discussion in the community and internationally about issues of language, about issues of race, about Black power generally. I remember teaching at a school that people told me, hey, those children there, they don't know English. Why do you want to go and teach there? Because English is what I was teaching at the time. And what struck me was that, and that was one of my most exciting teaching experiences, simply because I enjoyed presenting the Grenadian Creole that we spoke as an excellent language with no power internationally. So I was also learning from that particular region how people spoke, where the words came from. And I was excited about that and saying, hey, this is a wonderful language, but for international communication, we need, let's look at English, let's look at Spanish, etc. And why. So just discussing issues of language and power was fascinating for me. And because I loved all of the Creole, I think I had a particular approach to the teaching of English. And I suspect that a lot of the young people I taught then, and if any of them listening and saying, no, I didn't think this at all, that would be interesting. But I suspect that a lot of the people I taught then appreciated my approach, and perhaps enjoyed that. I don't think I was as good a Spanish teacher because I also taught Spanish then. Because the way we learned Spanish, there's a lot of emphasis on the grammar and not as much emphasis on the use of the language. And in fact, it was after that teaching experience, realizing that I was really not that good on speaking. It was after that experience that I decided, hey, I'm going to go to a Spanish-speaking country. And after that experience, I went to Mexico. But that was the first part, right? But if I think of people I taught in England, for example, in the UK, where you had a strong Caribbean community and people sometimes born in the diaspora who were just interested in knowing what was going on and interested in the writing from the region, writing politics, etc. from the region. I think there too, the students, I had a great experience with the students in particular. I think here in the US, there's a different engagement with, or at least for me, there was a different engagement with students because people were not as informed about the Caribbean. And so that, people were born in the US in some cases, coming to you with, in some cases, because there were also people who didn't know about the Caribbean at all, white American students who wanted to study the region, so that I was approaching it from a different perspective. Perhaps also less forthcoming, looking back at it now, especially in the early period with issues like use of language, etc. Simply because my sense was that there was a more sort of judgmental attitude about issues of language. At least there is, in the United States. And I just, in fact, read an article by a student who describes himself as Black British, and he's now here in the US, talking about people's amazement or interest in a Black British accent, thinking, hey, this is not real, etc. So I think the US relationship with the Caribbean is very different from the British relationship with the Caribbean. So as conflictual as both can be, there is a strange way in which I felt better known in the UK than in the US these last years. And I pause as I say that because it seems so strange in a sense. These are the Americas, but the colonial relationship perhaps is what kind of underpins that story. You know, and perhaps I'm approaching some of that too in my current research, but I'll talk about that afterwards. That's as brief an answer as I can give to your question.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, well, again, while I was listening to you, it seems that, politics, injustice, and your engagement is also an important part of your story. Can you tell a bit about, the period of 1981 until 83?
Right.
What was going on in Grenada and what was your role within that?
Okay, while I was here in the US in 1979, there was a revolutionary government in Grenada. March 13th, 1979 is still remembered as the day of the revolution. What essentially happened there is that a group of young people, generally young people at the time, who opposed the regime of Eric Matthew Gary, essentially, while he was out of the country, took control of the government and asked people, in a strange way, one might say it was revolution by radio, asked people who supported their perspectives to go out onto the streets, go to the police stations, ask police to put up a white flag, etc. And at the beginning, that revolutionary government was really very popular. And I knew something about the individuals involved because I had come to the US in 78 after a lot of the struggles in Grenada, a lot of the demonstrations at the time that I was teaching in Grenada, for example. Children were very often out on the streets demonstrating against the Gary regime. And I was a part of those demonstrations of the 70s, shaped by Black Power and by, the ideas of people who had returned to the country from studying at Howard University, at University of London, at various places. So a group of young intellectuals who looked at the situation in their country and said, look, hold on here. This is not what we want. We don't think that elections are fair. We won't ever win if we enter the system. So that's what happened in 1979, March 1979. And because in terms of the ideological leanings, etc., and it started off very much as a Black Power movement. In terms of the leanings, I thought, I like what is happening here. I wouldn't mind being a part of this. So I went back to Grenada after doing my degree in Latin American Studies, entered the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was a researcher on Latin America. and the Caribbean. Now that whole thing, and I said I worked from 1981 to 1983 because this attempt at revolution collapsed in 1983. And it collapsed really essentially. Some people focus exclusively on the invasion by the US, which happened subsequently. But there were lots of internal divisions. And although I did not support the invasion by the US, because, I for social justice issues, for, just political power, issues of political power and condescension, etc. I cannot support that kind of invasion of a small country by a large power. But I also think that locally, political leaders made tremendous mistakes. And I think what was more destructive psychologically for people was the killing of the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. So it was internal party divisions and party confusion. And also for me, psychologically, while I opposed the invasion, I thought that the internal divisions, I don't want to say were more destructive, but was certainly terrible for the country. So that's it. And then in 1983, when that whole process collapsed, because as I say, it collapsed both because of the internal divisions, and then the US used the opportunity. I think it was just after the US had had a failure in some other part of the world. So they used the opportunity to have an easy victory in Grenada. And it was after 1983 that after all of that I went to the UK.
And if you look at that period now, because after the UK, you ultimately the last 26 years or so, right?
Yeah.
You have been living in the US. Are you disappointed about what has happened? How do you feel at this moment about
it? The short answer is yes, I am. And I should also say that although for the last 26 years I've been here in the US, I am also constantly in Grenada. For 2 or 3 years that I was here in the US, I was also, not for the first 2 or 3, but for 3 of the first 5 years or so in the US, I was also doing 1 semester in the US, 1 semester in Grenada. So, and now my mother, who used to live here with me and who is still a storyteller, although not as lucid in some things, but still a storyteller at 101.
Wow.
She is in Grenada.
Okay.
So, I'm also constantly there. And I am disappointed that what I thought from 1979 to 1982, let's say, the kind of leadership, the kind of progressive ideas that were it is my sense, and I'm very cautious here because I don't like to pronounce about a country that I don't live in. But it is my sense that Grenada has lost a lot of that. And I think there are times when particular governments, acknowledging it or not, take ideas from that 79 to 82 period. And I'm pleased when that happens, because very often those are good ideas that they're taking. But generally, one thing that I am completely distressed about where Grenada is concerned at the moment is that for the last few years, there's no public library. And that seems to me reprehensible. I've spoken about it publicly. The library was closed because of storm damage. And as, for example, Jamaica Kincaid wrote about something like that in Antigua years ago. But the Grenada case, for a few years, the Grenada library has been closed. And it seems to me that a responsible government, and I'm not saying that that my critique is not only of the present government and its response to this, but the government before them also did not get the library going. I've spoken to individuals about this issue. So hopefully they're doing something, because I keep hearing that, oh yes, we're fixing it. But I think something like that seems to me very basic when you can say that for years the country has not had a public library. It seems quite amazing. So yeah, there are things I am unhappy with, but I wouldn't like to make any huge pronouncements as someone living outside of the country. There are people in the country who are trying to do something about that, and who I think have much more of a right, in a sense, to express their opinions, because they are there experiencing the different things.
Would you ultimately, like your mom did, go back and live there really permanently? Or will you stay in the US? What are your thoughts?
Well, I suspect once you've been away a long time, it will be a constant movement. So I will never leave Grenada completely, which is a huge thing for me to say now, because after 1983, not just because of invasion, but because of my disappointment with what had happened politically within the country, I said, this is it. But I imagine that, that this is it was because of the pain of the moment. Now I say that even though I will probably not live continually in Grenada, I will be back and forth, perhaps between here and there. That's what I see at the moment.
My organization is an NGO and celebrated its 75th anniversary last year. We also took that time to reflect on how we had been doing as an organization. And then one of the big topics for us is also, did we do enough around racial justice? Are we doing enough, et cetera, et cetera? So my question to you is a little bit more general, is if you look at the NGO sector as a whole, and you look at their activities, in the realm of racial justice, injustice, etc. What is your opinion? What do you think? How did the NGO sector do? And I do realize it's a difficult question because there are so many different types of NGOs. So maybe my question is specifically about NGOs in the US. And what have you seen, and what's your opinion about it? So,
okay. Well, in the first place, let me say that your question made me realize that I should clarify something. because although the revolutionary movement, what became the People's Revolutionary Government, we had young people there who had come out of the Black Power movement a few years into that organization. They became interested also in Marxism-Leninism. So that although it started off with Black Power, there was also Marxist-Leninist ideology later on. So I thought it was important to clarify that. Where the racial justice and the NGO sector is concerned, I wouldn't say too much about NGO sector here, but as somebody who grew up in Grenada, I guess I was more exposed by NGOs to what that sector was doing in Grenada as related to education, to gender inequities, with particular concern for women, sexual and physical abuse of women and girls, and generally also economic inequality. And as I speak here, I'm thinking, for example, of an organization called Grenada, Grenada Grenada Community Development Association, which throughout that period, which is still existing, run by Judy Williams, and which throughout that period of the 70s and 80s, I was always in touch with what they were doing as an organization, and I thought that work was so important. So I think the NGO sector has done some excellent work in Grenada. There are also other organizations that focused on education. Also thinking of Decima Williams, who is, very concerned about was also part of promoting SDGs. And all of that that I mentioned, well, a lot of that comes out of the NGO sector in Grenada. So I think some excellent work has been done there.
Okay. I'd like to piggyback on what you mentioned around the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. I try within my podcast often to talk about that, because I think it's important for people to know that they exist. And they might not be perfect, but I think it's a good thing that we as a world have established these goals that we are trying to aim for. If I ask you to lift up, the topic of Sustainable Development Goals, what is it that you would like the listeners to know about the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, I guess for one thing, I suspect that some of I'm glad you spelled it out, Sustainable Development Goals, because I suspect that some of the listeners, if we just say SDGs, would be wondering what on earth are SDGs. But, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, they are in fact things we think about without naming them necessarily SDGs. And I would say that the UN is also taking its lead from communities which have named some of these goals for years. No poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in a sense, I think that parents, for example, have constantly been saying to children, I want you to get a good education, right? Health is important, etc. Think of those who are hungry in the world. So these, when I think of the SDGs, I think, all right, let's bring it down to basics. These are things that we talk about. I also, think of songs.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the Mighty Diamonds in the 1970s had a song that was, I need a roof over my head and bread on my table with love in my heart for everyone. I say, okay, the people's goals, the UN SDGs are there. So they're people's goals to me, re-articulated in the organization, envisioning the importance of areas that are relevant to our lives and things that we talk about all the time. And as I think of the goals, I think of the importance of the emphasis on things like climate, for example, not necessarily talked about by parents in those same terms years ago, but also, I think, for example, of the way that as we think about climate and the environment, and I know we started off with the term SDGs, but I think how my father, who certainly did not know the term SDG or think of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, would say to me something like, my father was a farmer, and he would say to me something like, you see, we can't cut down all of those trees. We need that for windbreak. We need that for, when there are weather issues, so things like that. So I think of the SDGs as things that are very relevant to our lives and that we have always been concerned about. And I think it is great that the UN focuses, is encouraging a focus on them, so that when I said to my daughter, for example, SDGs, she said, oh yes, we have those, they make us look at those in school. And I thought, great.
You were referring to a song. I always talk about music as well with my guests, and if I ask you to come up with a song or a piece of music that best embodies who you are, what you are about, what song or piece of music would that be? Is that the song that you just mentioned, or is it another song?
No, there are so many songs.
Yeah.
And so that is difficult to say. And the Mighty Diamonds, yeah, that's one of them. But there are so many songs that when you ask,
you have to pick one.
Oh gosh. So that is very difficult. Perhaps Singing Sandra's Ancient Rhythms. Singing Sandra is a Calypsonian, a woman Calypsonian. She's from Trinidad and Tobago. And Ancient Rhythms, Sandra died last year. She was born in 1957. And I would choose that perhaps because the poet singer is calling out to ancestors. She's calling on traditional Yoruba deities. And I choose it not for the specific religion, but for the idea of spirituality, of a call to Black ancestry for strength. In the song, she says, from across the continent that someone's described as dark, I feel a rhythm, I feel a vibration, I feel a spark. And I like the triumphant defiance of that song. It's an offering, it's a chanting of her journey. She's, in the song, she says, when my spirit is feeling low, something deep in the rhythm, in the ancient rhythm, calls to me. So I would probably choose, if I were forced to choose one of the
yes, I'm
many
forcing
songs, of the many songs, I would choose Sandra's Ancient Rhythms.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, you know that this podcast is a spin-off of a 100-mile walk that I started 10 years ago, and I finished the 10th last October. And so I try to walk to raise awareness and funds for, to end hunger, poverty, and injustice. If you would be asked to walk 100 miles in a week, why would you walk?
Okay, well, congratulations on finishing the last one. At least not the last one, but the 10th. Well, I would not now consider physically walking 100 miles, but I think more about metaphorically walking those miles. Some miles, perhaps we might say, further than parents and ancestors walked. Not because they didn't walk far enough, but because their walking helped to direct my steps. And that I would walk, part of the story of my broader interest in social justice issues. Because just as I marched in the 70s for racial and social justice issues, those issues could get me back out on the streets if I were physically able to do that now.
I'm often accompanied by other people when I do this 100-mile walk. And then we talk about, what is the purpose of life? What drives you? And then very often we talk about religion and spirituality. And especially about younger generation. What are you seeing among youth in your community around these topics of religion and spirituality? What is your observation?
I believe that there is a very complex answer to how we are, who we are. And, as I look at an answer that I haven't figured out, and I think that where young people are concerned, I worry in recent times, especially about young people and mental health. This period of withdrawal from the world. I think of how ideas are being shaped, not just here, but also in Grenada and the rest of the Caribbean. I think of the virus, of course. I think it's upsetting that some seem to be putting themselves at more risk because they're not convinced of the need for vaccinations, for example. So I can't think of young people today without thinking of something like that. And I realize that some people are not pretending to be afraid, that they are actually afraid of the vaccinations. So, I'm conscious of that too. Their fear leads them to do something very different from what my fear leads me to do. And so as I think of spirituality, I think of all of those things. I worry that young people are not getting the opportunity to meet and greet in ways that we have come to think of as normal, to form intimate relationships, alliances, etc. And there seems to me, as I think of spirituality, I think that there seems to me to be something huge going on, not just in my individual environment, but in the world, in the universe. It is as if, to me, we have been put to sit and assess, something big about our ways of being. And since you asked about young people generally, I would say, for example, that over the last few years, it was great over the last couple of years, it's great to see people, young and old, but certainly more young people, out there on the streets expressing their views. And it seems to me that, and I think of spirituality in that broad sense, because it seems to me that these things would continue, that kind of expression will continue, because it must. Because life itself is that kind of cycle. So I see ideas of spirituality also bound up with ideas of struggle and human progress.
Are you hopeful, that we as a world, but especially then the younger generation, will be able to move forward in a more positive way, that this moment, which seems to be, that if I listen to you carefully, maybe this is, universe is telling us, use this moment to really reflect, to bring our lives and this world, forward in a more positive way. Are you still hopeful?
Yes. In spite of the fact that this is a distressing time, I'm hopeful. I've said what are some of the things I worry about. But hope is in the knowledge that the journey goes on. That, each generation will, in spite of whatever is happening, continue to struggle for a deeper understanding of everyday lives, of existence, of interactions with others, etc. And again, I come back to songs because I guess that's the artist's kind of thing in me. I think of the Heptones, Jamaican rocksteady reggae vocal group, three young men singing 3-part harmonies. Again, and I go back here to the 1960s and 70s. They were active during that time, and they had a song called The Book of Rules. And in that book, in that song, they say, to quote them, people like you and me will be builders for eternity. And to me, that's where the hope is. The song says, each is given a bag of tools, a shapeless mass, and the book of rules. So, spiritually, I think that each person may decide they may focus on something different as the book of rules. And perhaps each generation carves something from that shapeless mass. And each individual tries to make something recognizable from this shapeless mass. And I think that hope lies in that, so that, young people, that's what they're trying to do, make something recognizable and something that, they can adhere to from the shapeless mass that they've been given. And I think that's where the hope is. The tools differ, but as the Heptones say, we will be builders for eternity.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure the listeners have figured out how smart you are, because although I forced you to come up with only one song, you have now mentioned already 3.
I'm glad I could get around that.
Well, time always flies. I have one last question for you, and that is to ask you, if you have one last message, an invitation, a question, or something else that you would like to share with the listeners that we did not touch upon today.
Well, we touched on a lot, but just to say that perhaps my current research is on Louise Langdon Norton Little, who she died in 91, who was the Grenadian mother of Malcolm X. And with that project, I'm trying to think of Louise Little herself and other Grenadian women like her and their impact on the stories of their children. So that's my current project.
And when do you hope to release the book, or will it be a book or?
It's a book, and it's also a digital project.
Okay.
And the digital project I'm getting support for the digital project, meaning people actually helping me with the digitizing, etc., talking to me about that, from the University of Maryland's African American Digital Humanities Project, AdHum. So it will be a digital project, and it will also be a book. Later this year, I should be able to talk about a website for the digital project.
Okay, so if you can, as soon as you know more, if you can let me know, then I can still add it later on to the podcast notes, so that people can find it out. Yeah, I would like to thank you for your willingness to talk with me, giving me time, sharing your knowledge and your experience and your stories. Most of all, I really enjoyed it, and looking forward to the book that you're working on.
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking me. I think Walk, Talk, Listen is a wonderful idea. And I appreciate your asking me to participate.
Great. No, thank you. I have to thank you so much. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.